One of my favourite Ebenezer stories comes from my second trip down the Zambezi River. We were 7 of us in the boat. We set off late one afternoon. We paddled for a few hours with the sun setting in the west behind us. And then we noticed that the tide was beginning to change direction. So we got out of the river, we scrambled up through deep mud on the riverbank, found a dry spot, we lit a fire and cooked some rice and rested for a few hours. The Zambezi is tidal, so when the sea tides are coming in, the water is being forced back up the river. The river level rises, but the current is so strong that it's very difficult, unless you've got a motorboat, to travel against the current. So when the tide is not in your favour, you tend to just sit and rest and sleep and eat. But when the tide changes direction and the sea tides are going out, then the water is heading in the right direction for you. The river level does begin to drop, but you can travel quite fast with the current. So the Zambezi is a difficult river to navigate, constantly changing levels and also constantly changing speeds with the tides. We got back onto the water around midnight, I guess. We had our head torches on because we were nervous of territorial hippos in the river, and we paddled through that night. In the early morning, we got out again and we rested for a few hours, and then we paddled through the afternoon. And our travel continued like that through 2 days. Travel like that is exhausting. You don't properly sleep when you are resting. It's either muddy banks or mosquitoes all around you, or you're under the real heat of the sun. And so by the 3rd day, as we were beginning to approach the sea, most of us in the boat were absolutely exhausted. We'd been paddling hard, our hands were blistered, we were sleepless, we were uncomfortable, we were cramped in our boat. As we got close to the estuary, the seagulls were beginning to circle overhead. We knew we were approaching the sea. The tide by this point was moving very fast. We no longer needed to paddle, in fact, and the current was just pulling us along fast to our destination. It was actually a lovely feeling to be able to sit back in our cramped boat, but to relax, not to need to keep paddling. I remember I was sitting towards the back of the boat. I was daydreaming, I guess, but I noticed up ahead of us an island in the middle of the river, a sandy looking island. I saw that to the left of the island the water was fairly calm, and to the right it was fast moving, it was white water. I just noticed this, and then I kind of sleepily noticed that we were beginning to move slowly towards the left of the island. I didn't really think anything of this. As we approached the island, suddenly there was a loud bang at the front of the boat. The front of the boat hit something hard. The force of the water behind us swung the back of the boat round to the left until the boat was sideways onto the river. The force of the river against the side of the boat naturally pushed us over, and within a split second we had capsized. All of us were in the water. There was mayhem. There were bags everywhere. There were jerry cans in the water. In that split second, there was only one thought in my mind: a hippo! I was convinced we'd hit a submerged hippo. The water was filthy, it was brown, but to my amazement, I realised I was standing up, barefoot, in the water. My feet were on sand. And in that moment, I realised, actually, I was only in about 3 foot of water, and the front of the boat had hit a submerged sandbank. And as the level of the water was dropping, as the tide was rushing out, the sandbank was becoming more and more exposed. So thankfully, we hadn't hit a hippo, we just hit a sandbank. We righted the boat, we got it upright, we emptied it of water. It took a long time. We gathered all our things back together. We filled the boat up and we got back into the boat and we carried on paddling. Through the rest of that afternoon, I was thinking about this. I was thinking how close we had come to potential disaster. I realised that when you're being pulled along by the force of the current, it's so easy to not pay attention. It's so easy to sit back, unaware of what lies just inches beneath the surface. It could have been a submerged tree log. It could have been a hippo. And you're lulled into this false sense of security as you're carried on the force of the tide. But somehow you've got to stay alert. Anyway, after that surprising submerging in the water, we were refreshed. We spent the afternoon paddling, and finally that afternoon, late in the afternoon, we arrived at our destination. We pulled the canoe up onto the land, we pulled it back from the edge of the sea, we gathered our bags and we began to walk inland. We got to our first hut. It was a beautiful little hut in a clearing. It was an interesting, eclectic mix of things picked out of the sea and local materials. So the house was basically built on stilts. It was built with bamboo. It had a basic thatched roof, but had a beautifully built front gate with a kind of flexible hosing that they'd obviously found in the sea, forming a large arch over the gate. There was a nice hedge around the property. There was even a mirror, which was an empty shoe polish tin set into the wall. And there were different buoys that they'd rescued from the sea, which had been chopped in half and act as buckets. We greeted the people in the house and we headed inland. Later that afternoon, we met someone who was a believer. He became our guide for the next 2 or 3 days, and he took us around. He took us the next day, a 4-hour hike back to visit the chief, who we'd visited on a previous occasion. And as we hiked, this believer told us his story, and he had an amazing story. He had lived in this part of the Delta his entire life. I guess he was by this point in his late 40s, I imagine. But during the war, he'd been a fisherman. He'd caught fish, dried them in the sun, and then he would paddle them 3 days canoe paddle up the river to sell them in the neighbouring towns and villages. And on one of those trips back in the 1980s, he had met some believers. He'd spent time with them, and they had shared their faith with him, and he had become a Christian, become a follower of Jesus. And he'd returned back to his area with a Portuguese Bible. Now, I don't know when, but at some point in his life, he'd learnt to read. And so he returned to his village as the first believer in the village. Now, in that area, there is a lot of sickness, a lot of untreated ulcers and basic wounds which go untreated without antibiotics. They don't heal. We saw many people with horrible injuries, and infant mortality rate incredibly high. And in that area, traditional wisdom taught that all sickness and death is caused by bewitching, by witches, treacherous as they call them, cursing people. And for healing, people need to either get help from a traditional herbal doctor or some kind of spirit medium, diviner, who counters the curse of the witchcraft. And this is a central part of the worldview. Now, this local believer, his wife was heavily into these traditional beliefs, and really criticised him for his changed behaviour and his changed belief. She was fearful of him coming under a curse, and she told him that he would die. For years, actually, his family and his neighbours taunted him. They cursed him. They said that he would die for leaving the traditional culture, the ancestral belief system. For 7 years, he stood alone in his faith. He was aloof. He was ostracised. I asked him how he survived. He said he read his Bible and he prayed. But for years, he was the only believer. And then finally, the people closest to him, starting with his own family, began to believe what he was saying as they saw his changed behaviour and his life. And slowly people began to come to faith. As he told us about some of these people, there was obviously a pattern. Quite a lot of people who were sick had not been healed when they went to the traditional diviner, the local doctors, and they came to him to be prayed for, and some of those people were healed. And so these people who had been healed or delivered became local believers. And so now he was leading this small community, a small church. I was overjoyed when I heard this story. It was an amazing story, miraculous story. We, in our naivety, I guess we imagined that we were kind of taking God in with us to this community, only to discover, of course, that God was already there, that God was already at work. Amazingly, actually, in a couple of years' time, I got a maritime chart for this whole area. And as we were poring over this chart, there weren't many place names, but the very area where we were, the area of this first small church, was actually called on the map Kirk Point. And of course, Kirk is a church in Scotland. It was called Church Point. It was named after a Reverend John Kirk, who in the 1850s was the doctor on David Livingstone's Zambezi expedition up the river. And so for some reason, this precise point was called Kirk Point. And then 150 years later, it was the place where the first infant church was born. Now, I was amazed by this, amazed by the way God had sovereignly revealed himself to this man. But what really struck me as unbelievable and incredibly prophetic was his name. When he told us his name, I could not believe it. His name was Contramazi. It's a mixture of Portuguese. Contra means against, and mazi is a local Sena word, which is in many of the Bantu languages, it means water or tide. So his name, Contramazi, meant literally against the tide. He'd been given that name by his parents at birth. Years later, he became the first believer in his community, and he literally went against the tide of the prevalent belief system and stood totally on his own for close to a decade until a small church was born around him. And now here we were, a few years later, meeting him and hearing his amazing story, Contramazi, going against the tide. I was reminded of Jesus saying, wide is the path that leads to death and destruction. Many find it, but narrow is the path that leads to life, and few find it. An amazing story. And as I was thinking back to just a couple of days earlier, as we travelled down the Zambezi River, we were being rushed along by the tide and capsized. I realised that travelling with the tide is an easy option. You can relax, you can float, you're carried along effortlessly, lazily even, by the tide. But there's an immense force in that tide, and you're travelling essentially blind to the hidden dangers that lie beneath the surface. And sudden death happens when you're being carried by the tide. Travelling against the tide, against the current, is hard work. But essentially, you're in control of your own boat. Now, when you're kayaking, there's a method of crossing a fast-flowing river called ferry gliding. You head against the tide. If you imagine the river, the water in the river is travelling down the river, and that's coming from 12 o'clock. You head your boat into the current at maybe 11 o'clock, and you paddle across the river, but essentially you're paddling up the river. The force of the river coming down, with you pushing up into it at an angle, actually can take you neatly across the river. You can bisect the river by paddling against the tide. It's really the only safe way to travel across the river. If you try to cross the river with the tide behind you, you end up cutting across at a 45-degree angle and coming out miles down from where you want to be. Travelling against the tide is hard work, but essentially you're in control of your own boat. And I was reminded of Paul saying, don't be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And so Contramazi was this beautiful example for me of the incredible hard calling of going against the tide, but ultimately the safe calling, not being swept along by the force of people around him, but being transformed by the renewing of his mind and having the strength and the perseverance to go against the tide.